HR tried to shame my coworker's Instagram, so I showed them someone. Gelses. The meeting was supposed to be about a new employee, but by the time it was over, one of the longest-serving employees in our department was the one being investigated. And the strangest part? I walked into that room with absolutely no intention of getting anyone in trouble. If anything, I was trying to stop HR from doing exactly that. I had recently been promoted to assistant manager at the company where I work in Canada. It wasn't some massive promotion with a corner office and an executive parking spot, but it mattered to me. I'd worked hard for it, and for the first time, I was sitting in meetings where decisions were actually being made instead of just hearing about them afterward. That also meant I was beginning to see how some of those decisions were made. And sometimes, it wasn't pretty. One of the people I'd worked with for a long time was an older woman. I'll call Susan. When I first met Susan, I actually liked her. She'd been with the company for years, and she knew almost everything about how our department worked. If you couldn't find a document, Susan knew where it was. If some weird problem came up that nobody had seen before, there was a good chance Susan remembered the same thing happening 8 years ago. She was useful. Very useful. And she always made sure everyone knew it. Susan loved reminding younger employees how long she'd been there. If someone suggested changing a process, she'd say something like, "We've been doing it this way since before you got here." If a younger employee made a mistake, it wasn't just a mistake. It became evidence that young people don't know how to work anymore. And if somebody showed her a faster way to do something, sometimes she'd still refuse, simply because the idea hadn't come from her. Susan wasn't incompetent. Honestly, that almost made her harder to work with. She was actually pretty good at her job. She just seemed to believe that being good at it gave her permission to be unpleasant to anyone who hadn't accumulated as many years at the company as she had. Over time, our relationship got worse. There was never one huge confrontation. It was hundreds of little things. Little comments, eye rolls, corrections delivered just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. That particular condescending tone some people use when they're technically being polite, while making absolutely sure you understand that they think you're an idiot. After I got promoted, it got worse. Susan never directly said she thought I was too young to be an assistant manager. She didn't have to. Every time I asked her to do something differently, she'd remind me how. Many years she'd been there. Every time I made a decision she didn't agree with, she'd ask whether senior management had approved it. Not every time. Just often enough that I understood the message. Susan and I also followed each other on Instagram. Honestly, I don't remember who followed whom first. For a long time, I barely paid attention to what she posted. Pictures, random memes, family stuff, normal social media. Then I started noticing the things she reposted: political content, immigration content, posts complaining about what Canada was becoming, and increasingly, posts specifically targeting Indian immigrants. Our workplace is extremely diverse. I work with people whose families come from all over the world, including India, and I'm not someone who thinks having conservative political views automatically makes somebody racist. I've voted conservative myself. But some of what Susan reposted went far beyond disagreeing over immigration policy. There's a difference between saying, "I think Canada should reduce immigration," and basically saying, "These people don't belong here." Susan's reposts were starting to look a lot more like the second one. Some of them were the kind of posts that made you stop and wonder, did she actually read this before attaching her name to it? Apparently she did. Repeatedly. Still, I never reported her. Why would I? It was her personal Instagram. As much as I disliked some of what she posted, Susan wasn't putting it on a company account, and I didn't like the idea of employers policing what employees did. Outside of work, unless it directly affected the workplace, I believed people's personal social media should be their own business. Ironically, that belief is exactly what caused everything to explode. A few weeks after my promotion, We hired a young woman. I'll call her Emily. Emily was new, probably in her early 20s. And from what I could see, she was doing fine. She wasn't some superstar employee who walked in and transformed the department overnight. She was just new. She asked questions. Sometimes she needed help. She was learning. Basically, exactly what you'd expect from someone who had just started a new job. Then I was invited to a management meeting. There were several managers, one senior manager, and HR. Our HR representative was also an older woman. And, as it happened, she was pretty friendly with Susan. I knew they got along. I'd never really cared before. At one point in the meeting, HR said she wanted to discuss a concerning issue involving Emily. I assumed it would be attendance, maybe performance, something actually related to work. Instead, Emily's Instagram appeared on the television at the front of the conference room. I remember staring at the screen for a few seconds because I genuinely couldn't understand why I was looking at this. Woman's Instagram. The photo HR was concerned about showed Emily at what looked like a party. She was dressed for a night out. She happened to have a larger chest, and she was making an expression at the camera that HR apparently considered seductive. That was it. Nothing explicit. No mention of the company. No company uniform. She wasn't at work. She wasn't doing anything illegal. She was simply a young woman at a party. Looking like a young woman at a party. And now her photo was blown up on a television. While a room full of managers discussed whether it was appropriate, the whole thing made me uncomfortable. Imagine starting a new job, doing perfectly fine, and having absolutely no idea that somewhere in the building, a group of managers are sitting around looking at your personal social media and discussing your body. So I asked a simple question. What company policy did she violate? The answer was vague. Something about professionalism. So I asked whether our social media policy required employees to follow the workplace dress code in their personal photographs. No. I asked whether Emily mentioned the company in the post. No. I asked whether there had been any complaints about her actual work. Again, no. HR started explaining that employees still represent the company, even outside working hours. And that was when something clicked in my head, because if that was really the standard we were setting, then we had a much more interesting Instagram account to discuss. So I said, if we're reviewing employees' personal social media now, maybe we should take a look at Susan's Instagram too. The room went quiet. HR looked at me. What's wrong with Susan's Instagram? I said I'd seen several reposts that seemed much more relevant to the workplace than a young employee posting a picture of herself at a party. I didn't immediately say what they were. HR asked. So I told them. The posts about Indian people, the posts about immigration, political content that, in my opinion, had crossed pretty clearly from conservative political views into hostility toward an ethnic group. HR's attitude changed immediately. She started saying something about context, and that bothered me, because apparently, context hadn't mattered when Emily's body was on the television. I told them I wasn't actually advocating for the company to start policing everyone's Instagram. That was the entire point. If Emily's personal social media was none of our business, then Susan's wasn't either. But if HR was establishing that personal social media was relevant to the workplace, then we couldn't selectively apply that standard to the newest young woman in the department, while ignoring a veteran employee reposting material aimed at a group of people who actually worked in our company. Someone opened Susan's account. It didn't take long. The reposts weren't buried 5 years in the past. They were recent. A few people in the room started reading, and the atmosphere changed. The senior manager, who had been pretty quiet until then, looked at Emily's photo, still sitting on the television. Then he opened Facebook on his phone. He found a picture of himself on vacation with his family at the beach. No shirt, hairy chest and all. He held it up and said, "Here, You can have an HR discussion about me too. A few people laughed. HR didn't. But the point had landed. The discussion about Emily ended shortly afterward. Her Instagram disappeared from the television. Susan's Instagram didn't disappear quite so quickly. The senior manager wanted the posts reviewed. And because of the way the company handled things like that, HR would have to be involved, which meant Susan's friend in HR now had to formally review the very account I'd just brought to everyone's attention. I left that meeting with mixed feelings. On one hand, I was glad someone had finally pushed back on how Emily was being treated. On the other, I knew Susan. There was almost no chance she wouldn't eventually figure out who had mentioned her account. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Susan barely acknowledged that I existed. Normally, she'd at least say hello, even if she made it sound like she was doing me a favor. That morning, nothing. She walked past me like I wasn't there. Around lunchtime, she finally came over. "Can I talk to you?" Her tone told me this wasn't about work. I told her we could talk in the office. She closed the door. Then she asked, "Did you show management my Instagram?" I said no. Technically, I hadn't. Management had opened it themselves. That answer did not make her happier. You know what I mean. So I told her the truth. I had mentioned her reposts during a management discussion about another employee's personal social media. Susan immediately said her political views were none of the company's business. And the funny thing was, I agreed with her. "I actually agree with you." That stopped her for about 2 seconds. Then I explained what had happened. HR had put Emily's personal Instagram photo in front of a room full of managers and started discussing whether it was appropriate. I objected. When HR argued that personal social media could reflect on the company, I pointed out that they couldn't apply that standard selectively. Susan stared at me. "So you threw me under the bus?" "No. I asked them to apply the same rule to everyone." She said what she reposted had nothing to do with her ability to do her job. Again, I told her, that's exactly what I said about Emily. She didn't have a good answer for that. So she changed the argument. Emily was different, because her photo was unprofessional. I asked how. Susan said, "You know, no, explain it." She wouldn't, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting what everyone in that meeting had already understood. Emily was young. She was attractive. She had a large chest. And somebody in HR didn't like how she presented herself in a photograph, taken outside work. Finally, Susan told me I would regret making enemies with people who've been here longer than you. That bothered me more than almost anything else she'd said. Not because I was afraid, but because it confirmed exactly what I'd noticed since getting promoted. To Susan, seniority wasn't experience. It was power. I told her that if she had a problem with what happened in the meeting, she should take it up with HR. She smiled. "Oh, I will." Then she walked out. The next few days were incredibly tense. Susan became extremely careful around me. Not nicer. Careful. If I asked her to do something, she'd tell me to send it in an email. If we had a verbal conversation, sometimes she'd send a follow-up email, summarizing what we'd discussed. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was building a paper trail. So, I started doing the same. Not aggressively, just professionally. If Susan wanted everything documented, everything could be documented. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. Other employees started speaking up. Not to me, at first. To management. An Indian employee apparently asked whether the company was investigating someone's social media posts in our department. Another employee reported that Susan had made comments at work, comments that sounded very different now that people had seen the kind of material she was publicly reposting. Then another person spoke up. I wasn't given every detail because I wasn't part of the investigation team, but it slowly became clear that this wasn't just about Instagram anymore, and that distinction mattered. The company couldn't simply punish Susan because management disliked her. Political views But if those public posts lined up with comments or behavior targeting coworkers from a protected group, that was a very different problem. About a week later, I was called into another meeting. This one was much smaller. HR was there. The senior manager was there. And I was there because I'd been the first person to raise the issue. The senior manager started by telling me something I genuinely appreciated. The company had reviewed how the original discussion about Emily had been handled. Putting her personal photo in front of a room full of managers had been inappropriate. Unless there was an actual issue tied to company policy or the workplace, personal social media was not something managers should casually pull up and critique. In other words, the company had quietly admitted that I'd been right about the original issue. Then we talked about Susan. The investigation had expanded beyond the reposts. Apparently, enough employees had come forward that management could no longer treat this as nothing more than someone having political opinions. Outside work. I wasn't told everything. I didn't need to be. But Susan was formally disciplined. She was also required to complete workplace conduct training, and management made it very clear that any retaliation against people involved in the review would create a much bigger problem for her. She wasn't fired. And honestly, I was relieved. Despite everything, I'd never wanted Susan to lose her livelihood because of an argument I'd made in a meeting. What I wanted was for the company to stop using one standard for a young, new employee and another standard for people they already knew and liked. Susan didn't seem to see that distinction. For about 2 weeks, she treated me as though I'd personally destroyed her life. Then, she made a mistake. She started complaining about the investigation to coworkers, not directly attacking anyone, just little comments. Things like, "Guess you have to be careful about every word you say around here now." Or, "Some people get one little promotion and suddenly think they can police everybody." Eventually, those comments reached management. Susan got called in again. When she came back out, she didn't say another word about it. But the strangest consequence of the whole situation actually happened to HR. After everything, management tightened the way social media concerns were handled. No more casually opening someone's Instagram in a meeting because somebody didn't like a photograph. If there was a genuine issue, it had to connect to an actual company policy or a workplace problem, which meant the entire story ended almost exactly where I thought it should have started. As far as I know, Emily never learned that her photo had once been the subject of a management meeting. I hope she never does. She kept working. She got better at the job. And a few months later, she was simply another normal employee, like everybody else. Susan stayed too. She and I never became friends again. That ship had sailed. But something about her changed. She stopped questioning every decision I made. The little comments about younger employees became much less frequent, and she definitely stopped reminding me every 5 minutes how long she'd worked at the company. One afternoon, a few months later, I walked past the break room and heard Susan helping a new employee with something. The employee thanked her. Susan just said, "No problem. You'll get used to it." No lecture about young people, no reminder of how long she'd been there. Just help. Maybe the investigation changed her. Maybe being formally disciplined scared her. Or maybe she simply realized that management was paying attention now. Honestly, I don't know. And I don't really care. Because I never needed Susan to become a better person. I just needed her to understand that being a veteran employee didn't mean she got to live by a different set of rules. And the funniest part? This entire mess started because HR wanted to scrutinize one young woman's Instagram photo. If they had simply judged Emily by the work she actually did, Susan's account would never have come up. Nobody would have searched through her reposts. Nobody would have started asking whether those views were spilling into the workplace. Nobody would have come forward. Susan probably would have continued exactly as she had for years. But HR decided that personal social media was fair game. So, I agreed. I just asked them to apply the rule fairly. They wanted to put somebody's Instagram on the big screen. They just picked the wrong Instagram.